Hi everyone, it's Dr. Hall. Welcome to Lecture 19, Learning and Memory Part 1. For this lecture, we're going to break it down into 4 sections, starting by talking about the different types of memories, then the processes by which we're believed to store those memories in our brain, then a couple of the special cell populations that have been identified as playing a role in memory, and then a process by which we seem to kind of encode or wire these things into our brain, which is called long-term potentiation. So let's start with types of memory. So first of all, what is memory? So let's be clear. So this is information that has been stored in the brain in some way and often can be recalled, sometimes consciously or sometimes like it's unconsciously playing a role, right? So certainly when we think of memories, we think of kind of these sentimental things, do you remember this thing that happened? Oh, wasn't that fun when this so-and-so went dancing. Here is my friend's birthday party where it looks like I am getting lit off of the Kool-Aid, right? So these, that's what we think of these kind of sentimental memories. But also the fact that acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter released from the neuromuscular junction. That is a memory, right? That is information that you've stored and hopefully can easily retrieve. So those are things that we are, kind of consciously aware of, things that we can describe. But then there's also things that we just know how to do, for example, right? So you can tie your shoe. I'm an oldie, so I do it the first way that they say is the wrong way. So that is a type of memory as well, that kind of motor memory or muscle memory, like when you learned the dance step in class. So we have ways of describing these types of memory. So the first one, the things that you can tell stories about, is the declarative or explicit memory, right? So it's not explicit in this sense of the word, right? That it has, explicit content. It's explicit in terms of like, well, I do declare. You can name it, you can talk about it, you can say this thing happened or this is what's happening in the synapse. These are things that you can talk about and be consciously aware of. And then on the other side, you have the non-declarative or the implicit things. And so there's no speech bubble for that because these are just things that are happening kind of subconsciously or automatically or underneath your surface awareness. So the declarative or explicit, the ones you can talk about, they have 2 different subtypes. So one is semantic. So that's like words and facts and definitions, right? So that's all of the things that you're learning about in this class for the most part is semantic memories, which are a subtype of declarative or explicit. But then there's also episodic. So the ability to, they often talk about this as like autobiographical memory, the ability to tell stories or to remember things that happened to you, right? So we learned a dance step in lab one week, right? That is an episodic memory. You're telling a story of something that happened. So if we kind of further expand our tree now, so we've talked about 2 different subtypes of declarative or explicit memories. We've got semantic, which are mostly facts, and then episodic, which are stories and things that have happened. So let's take a look at the non-declarative or implicit. So there are also a couple of subtypes here. So one is that procedural or skill memory, like tying your shoes, right? Like doing a tap dance. Once you've done it a bunch of times, it kind of goes on autopilot. You don't really have to think about it. We have all types of procedural and motor skill memories that we use all the time. So when you're writing, when you're typing, when you're walking, when you're feeding yourself, brushing your hair, brushing your teeth, right? All of these things we just kind of run on autopilot. So that's stored information of those patterns of activities. So that's a form of memory. That's stored information that then we reactivate or retrieve when we need to use it. All right, we'll put Daffy Duck away. He's not doing the tap step that you guys learned. He's doing something called a time step, actually. All right, then the one other type, there are various, but the other type we're going to talk about of non-declarative or implicit memories is priming. And this is where previous knowledge or information, either very recent or in the past, shapes how you interpret and respond to events. So you can prime people to respond in different ways to the same situation by giving them previous prompts or suggestions or bits of knowledge. For example, if we're playing Hangman and I give you, and you've got this, right? And so now take a moment and think, okay, all right, what might those other letters be? And believe it or not, I've already primed you a little bit. And so some of you might have come up with dance, right? So there's lots of different words that start with D that are, how many letters is this? 5-letter words that start with D that you could have come up with, right? If I had shown you pictures of flowers, you might have come up with daisy first, right? So this is, knowledge and information that then is changing how you respond to a prompt depending on the situation and depending on your past experiences. So that was a situational thing. I gave you a prompt very close to the time that I was going to ask you to assess a situation, but a lot of the things that are baked into us from years of experience and years of exposure to different pieces of information will also shape how we see and interpret and respond to our environment. And so that is one of the things that is behind something called implicit bias. So bias in general is something that is affecting how you see and interpret the world that results in you actually coming to kind of an incorrect conclusion. So in science, we're always looking for ways to minimize bias, right? So we do randomized controlled clinical trials where it's blinded, and even the researchers don't know when they're assessing a patient who is in which group, because their unconscious bias might make them be like, oh yeah, they're better, because if they know that they're in the treatment group. So we go to great lengths to try to avoid introducing bias into scientific studies. Sometimes there's nothing you can do. It's just a thing, but we work as hard as we can to get rid of it. So bias is something you don't want, right? It's something, if you're biased against somebody, that means that you have a predisposition to judge them in a way that's not particularly fair or correct. So this implicit bias, right? This is implicit. It's kind of unconscious. You're not even aware that it's happening. It's underneath the surface, and it can influence how you perceive events, right? As we just saw. So what we see is that, for example, physicians in general, both white and physicians of color, will take people of color's complaints of their symptoms less seriously, right? So this is where we start to see a lot of some of the problems of how our brain is wired in terms of previous information and in terms of how we respond to events. So there's a media assignment that's optional where you can read more about implicit bias, and you can actually even take a test to assess your own implicit biases. My experience is that students are often very surprised to realize how much bias they actually have operating underneath the surface, and that's not your fault. That's just human nature. So the trick then becomes to recognize it and correct for it. Okay. So types of memory then, we have our declarative or explicit, the things you can talk about. So facts is semantic, stories is episodic, and then we have our non-declarative or implicit stuff that's happening underneath the surface, which includes our procedural or our motor memories, and then priming, which is how past experiences and past information will kind of tend us to see things in different light. So we have to be careful of that implicit bias that can arise from that. So memory is stored information. This is the same thing, just in a different format. Declarative or explicit can be stated. So semantic is facts and details. Episodic is events and happenings. Non-declarative or implicit is kind of unconscious, automatic, can't be described, happening underneath the surface. So that's that motor memory for doing physical tasks and dance numbers. And then that priming, where past experiences, past knowledge influences how we respond to new situations, and perhaps may make us respond improperly or incorrectly. All right, that's it for 19A.